In the early months of 1942, one question haunted the minds of military analysts across the Pacific, yet few dared to ask it aloud. Could an entire empire so confident in its own might be blind to the very forces it underestimated? Stay with me until the end, and I will help answer the question. It is a question that begins not with defeat, but with triumph. In the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire moved with a precision and boldness that seemed unstoppable. Japanese soldiers advanced through Southeast Asia, their fleets gliding across the Pacific, and their air forces striking with deadly efficiency. The American forces, still reeling from the shock of December 7th, were forced into retreat after retreat. Each victory, each conquest, fed into a dangerous narrative inside the minds of Japan's generals and admirals that they had broken the back of a nation that could not fight back. In October 1941, even before the outbreak of open war in the Pacific, Japanese military leaders had already begun to speak with an almost prophetic certainty about America's weaknesses. They believed that the United States, with its vast territory, was soft, complacent, and reliant on comfort rather than courage. To these men, America's industrial might was impressive but brittle, its citizens easily cowed by hardship, and its military untested in a real conflict with a disciplined, battle-hardened adversary. When the Imperial Japanese Navy struck Pearl Harbor, it was not merely a tactical operation. It was the embodiment of this belief, a strike designed to stun and intimidate, and to cement Japan's supremacy in the Pacific. After December 7, 1941, the sense of triumph only grew. In January 1942, Japanese forces captured the Philippines with alarming speed. By February, they had taken Singapore, a fortress once considered impregnable by the British Empire. Each conquest was celebrated not just as a military victory, but as proof of a worldview. Japan was destined to dominate Asia, and the Americans were ill-prepared to contest that destiny. Japanese war correspondents reported from the front lines with a tone of inevitability, calling each victory a step toward a new order in the Pacific. The news that reached Tokyo painted a picture of a nation at the height of its power, and the Japanese leaders, intoxicated by success, began to plan further campaigns with growing audacity. In these early months, the confidence of Japan's military leaders was intertwined with cultural and historical notions of superiority. They had observed the rapid modernization of Japan over the preceding decades and attributed it to a unique discipline and spirit. Comparisons to Western nations were often dismissive. They believed that Western democracies, particularly the United States, were weak precisely because they were open and divided, whereas Japan's unity under the emperor gave it strength. This belief was reinforced by initial intelligence reports, which often underestimated American resolve. To Japanese planners, the attack on Pearl Harbor should have crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, buying Japan time to consolidate its empire and negotiate favorable terms. They saw the United States not as a resilient adversary, but as a nation that would sue for peace once faced with the enormity of its losses. Yet behind this confidence, there were cracks that Japanese leadership refused to acknowledge. While victories in the Philippines, Malaya, and Singapore were undeniable, they masked the challenges of maintaining supply lines across thousands of miles of ocean. Japan's industrial capacity, though formidable, could not match the combined output of the United States and its allies. Every new territory captured required garrisons, transportation networks, and constant resupply. And yet, these logistical realities were often ignored in the euphoria of conquest. Japanese leaders, in their arrogance, assumed that swift victories equated to strategic security. In early 1942, the psychological effect of this overconfidence was visible in the planning of subsequent operations. Japanese admirals spoke openly of invading Midway, a small atoll hundreds of miles northwest of Hawaii, with the expectation that the Americans would be unable to respond. The plan, meticulously detailed and heavily reliant on secrecy, assumed that American intelligence and military decision-making were inferior. The arrogance of these assumptions was staggering. They believed that by striking key points and demonstrating overwhelming force, the Americans would surrender to what they perceived as inevitable Japanese supremacy. The culture of overconfidence was not limited to generals and admirals. Political leaders, industrial planners, and even ordinary citizens absorbed the message of invincibility. Propaganda posters celebrated Japan's martial prowess and portrayed the United States as a decadent, easily intimidated power. Newspapers emphasized the speed and decisiveness of Japanese victories, while largely ignoring the growing challenges of holding such a vast empire. In schools, children learned that Japan had taken the initiative in shaping the destiny of the Pacific, while the enemy was portrayed as hesitant and morally weak. By reinforcing this narrative across society, Japan created an echo chamber of certainty, one that would blind its leaders to the warnings of those who had seen the broader picture. Amid this rising tide of confidence, there were voices of caution, though they were often drowned out. Senior officers who had studied the United States or understood the scope of industrial production warned that underestimating America could be catastrophic. They argued that the United States possessed not only immense natural resources, but also a society capable of mobilizing on a scale that Japan could not match. Yet these warnings were overshadowed by the dominant sentiment that Japan's victories were proof of national genius, discipline, and divine favor. The psychological momentum of success was too powerful to resist. By March 1942, Japanese forces had reached the farthest extents of their advance. In the Solomon Islands, in New Guinea, and across the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese Empire appeared unstoppable. Fleet commanders reported that morale was high, and soldiers often expressed a belief in the inevitability of Japanese victory. The mindset of invincibility was reinforced at every level, from the high councils in Tokyo to the men on the front lines. In this atmosphere, any suggestion that the United States might recover or strike back was treated with skepticism, even derision. Yet, as history would soon reveal, this confidence was both the strength and the Achilles heel of Japan in the early stages of World War II. By creating an illusion of invulnerability, Japan blinded itself to the realities of industrial capacity, logistical limits, and the resilience of a nation that, until attacked, had been underestimated by nearly everyone. In the early months of 1942, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test these assumptions to the breaking point. Japan's victories had built a giant of perception, one that would soon face the full measure of the American response it had so arrogantly dismissed. In the prelude to war, Japan's rise was meteoric and intoxicating. The combination of military skill, daring operations, and cultural confidence created a narrative of dominance that few outside the empire questioned. Within Japan, however, this narrative came dangerously close to blinding leaders to the deeper truths about their adversary. It was a confidence that would soon encounter the sobering reality of a nation underestimated and misjudged. In the late 1920s, long before the outbreak of war in the Pacific, Admiral Yamamoto traveled across the United States. Few in Japan's military hierarchy understood America as he did, for Yamamoto had witnessed firsthand the vastness of its industrial power and the resilience of its people. He had studied at Harvard University, toured the factories of Detroit, and observed the inner workings of American shipyards and aircraft production facilities. His experiences in the United States left him with a profound understanding that would later shape his strategic thinking. Yet, even as he returned to Japan with these insights, many of his contemporaries dismissed his warnings, blinded by the same overconfidence that followed Pearl Harbor. In 1925, Yamamoto arrived in the United States with a dual purpose: to learn the English language and to study naval strategies abroad. During his time in Harvard, he was struck by the scale and efficiency of American education and industry. Unlike the Japanese system, which emphasized rigid hierarchy and obedience, American institutions foster innovation and problem-solving at every level. Yamamoto observed that Americans were capable of organizing massive projects with remarkable speed, and he began to understand that the nation's industrial capacity was as formidable a weapon as any fleet of battleships. His travels took him to Detroit, Michigan, the heart of American automotive manufacturing. There, he walked through the assembly lines of Ford Motor Company and other factories that churned out vehicles at unprecedented rates. Yamamoto was fascinated by the integration of machinery, labor, and management. He noted that American workers could be trained quickly, machines could be retooled efficiently, and production could scale to meet extraordinary demands. These observations left a lasting impression on him. He realized that the United States could mobilize for war on a scale that Japan could scarcely imagine, producing thousands of ships, aircraft, and vehicles far faster than any Japanese yard could manage. Yamamoto also visited shipyards on the eastern seaboard, where he watched the construction of large vessels and spoke with engineers about design and production processes. He saw the potential for rapid expansion of naval capabilities, noting that American industrial organization allowed for simultaneous construction of multiple classes of ships. Unlike in Japan, where limited resources and labor created bottlenecks, the United States possessed both the raw materials and the workforce to sustain prolonged production. Yamamoto understood that a war with America would not be short. The Japanese assumption that a single decisive strike could win the Pacific was dangerously naive, and he warned repeatedly that underestimating the United States would be catastrophic. During his time in the United States, Yamamoto also observed society itself. He visited schools, factories, and neighborhoods, noting the character of the American people. He was struck by their optimism, resourcefulness, and resilience. Americans endured hardship with a determination that Japanese leaders often failed to anticipate. Yamamoto understood that national character mattered in war just as much as fleets and weapons. A society that could endure rationing, mobilize labor, and sustain morale would not collapse after a single attack. This insight contrasted sharply with the prevailing belief among Japanese generals and admirals that Americans were soft and indulgent. When he returned to Japan in the late 1920s, Yamamoto carried these lessons with him into the Navy. He rose quickly through the ranks, but he did not always find willing ears. Japanese military culture prized loyalty, tradition, and past victories over analysis of foreign capabilities. Many of his colleagues dismissed his warnings, arguing that Japan's disciplined forces and moral superiority would guarantee victory in any conflict. Yet Yamamoto remained steadfast. He continued to emphasize that the United States was a formidable adversary not to be underestimated, both in terms of industrial capacity and societal resilience. By the time war broke out in December 1941, Yamamoto's concerns had intensified. He had watched as Japan's rapid expansion after Pearl Harbor created a dangerous illusion of invincibility. The confidence that had carried Japanese forces through Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands was, in his view, a double-edged sword. Yamamoto knew that if the United States were properly mobilized, Japan could face defeat, even after achieving spectacular early victories. He famously remarked that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but beyond that, the outcome of war would favor the United States. Yamamoto's strategic insight was reflected in his planning for the Pacific War. While many Japanese leaders envisioned a series of offensive campaigns that would cripple America and secure dominance in the Pacific, Yamamoto advocated for caution. He understood that Japan's victories would be fleeting if the Americans were allowed to recover and mobilize fully. His proposals often emphasized the importance of timing, logistics, and strategic restraint. He sought to strike decisive blows quickly while maintaining the flexibility to respond to unforeseen challenges. Despite his foresight, Yamamoto faced immense political pressure. Japan's military leadership was driven by nationalism, pride, and a belief in inevitable dominance. They favored bold and aggressive action, often dismissing Yamamoto's warnings as overly cautious. The attack on Pearl Harbor, for instance, was approved against his advice that a prolonged war with the United States would be disastrous. Yamamoto's understanding of American industrial might clashed with the prevailing sentiment that Japan could secure victory through audacity and superior skill alone. Yamamoto's American education, however, remained a cornerstone of his strategic thinking. He continued to analyze American capabilities even as Japan advanced through the Pacific. He understood that every ship sunk and every island captured was only a temporary measure unless Japan could cripple the industrial base that would inevitably respond. His travels in the United States had taught him that the capacity to rebuild, rearm, and mobilize could not be underestimated. He foresaw the danger of underestimating not just the military, but the society that supported it. In private discussions with fellow officers, Yamamoto frequently emphasized that Japan was racing against time. The initial victories would not secure permanent dominance. He understood that the United States, with its vast industrial resources, could recover and strike back with overwhelming force. This foresight placed him in a difficult position. He was a leader of an offensive military, yet he recognized the strategic necessity of caution. History would later show that his warnings were prophetic. The very arrogance and overconfidence he had witnessed in Japan after Pearl Harbor blinded others to the threat he had foreseen. By early 1942, Yamamoto's observations of America had taken on an urgent significance. The empire he served was at the peak of its early war confidence, but he knew that the United States would not remain paralyzed indefinitely. The industrial centers he had once toured, the shipyards and factories, the workforce and organizational systems, all represented a latent power that could turn the tide of war. Yamamoto's insights highlighted a fundamental misjudgment in Japanese planning, the failure to recognize that the true strength of a nation lies not only in its armies or fleets, but in its ability to sustain, adapt, and endure. In June 1942, the vast expanse of the Pacific became the stage for a confrontation that would forever alter the course of World War II. The Battle of Midway, fought between the Japanese Imperial Navy and the United States Navy, was not merely a clash of ships and aircraft. It was a collision of assumptions, intelligence, and human will. Japan entered the battle with confidence born from months of victory, convinced that the Americans were a weakened opponent who could be decisively crushed with a single, well-coordinated strike. Yet, as the events unfolded between June 4th and June 7th, that confidence would be shattered, revealing the profound dangers of underestimating a resilient and industrially powerful adversary. In the early days of June 1942, Japanese planners had finalized their strategy to capture Midway Atoll, a small but strategically crucial island northwest of Hawaii. The plan, meticulously developed by Admiral Yamamoto and his staff, aimed to lure the remaining American aircraft carriers into a trap. The Japanese fleet, composed of aircraft carriers to battleships and supporting cruisers and destroyers, moved with precision and stealth, confident that their superior experience and preparation would ensure victory. Japanese commanders believed that by destroying the American carriers, they could eliminate the United States as a threat in the Pacific, securing Japan's empire and compelling America to negotiate for peace. The Japanese plan relied heavily on deception and timing. Yamamoto's fleet was divided into several task forces, each assigned specific roles in the operation. Reconnaissance aircraft were deployed to locate American positions, while strike groups were ready to deliver overwhelming blows to both land and naval targets. Japanese officers operated under the assumption that the Americans were unlikely to anticipate the assault or to respond effectively under pressure. Within the command centers of Tokyo and aboard the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, there was a palpable sense of inevitability. Japan expected that the battle would confirm its supremacy in the Pacific. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, however, American cryptographers had already broken key elements of Japan's naval code. By May 1942, U.S. intelligence officers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, had deduced that Midway was the intended target of the Japanese offensive. This insight provided Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, with a rare strategic advantage. Nimitz positioned his limited forces, including 3 aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, to ambush the Japanese fleet. This careful orchestration of intelligence, preparation, and resolve would become a decisive factor in the battle. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese aircraft struck Midway Island, aiming to destroy the American airfields and weaken the defenders. The initial attacks inflicted damage on the island's installations and caused casualties, reinforcing Japanese expectations of a swift campaign. Japanese leaders, confident in their calculations, did not anticipate the ferocity and coordination of the American counterattack. From Midway, American bombers and torpedo planes launched assaults on the approaching fleet, many flying into heavily defended airspace with little chance of survival. The courage and determination of American aircrews, despite suffering severe losses, began to disrupt the Japanese assumptions about the enemy's capabilities. The turning point came when American dive bombers located the Japanese carriers, caught at a vulnerable moment with aircraft fueled and armed on deck. The precision and timing of the American attack proved catastrophic for the Japanese fleet. Within minutes, bombs struck the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, igniting massive fires that would ultimately sink all 3 carriers. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, mounted a counterattack but was soon located and destroyed by follow-up strikes. In less than a day, Japan had lost 4 carriers, along with hundreds of experienced pilots and air crew personnel that could not be quickly replaced. The losses represented not only a tactical defeat, but a strategic disaster from which the Japanese Navy would struggle to recover. The Battle of Midway demonstrated the dangers of overconfidence and flawed assumptions. Japanese leaders had believed that American forces were weak and predictable, that their own victories guaranteed future success. They had underestimated the role of intelligence, the capacity of American society to respond under pressure, and the skill and courage of individual servicemen. Yamamoto, who had foreseen the industrial and societal potential of the United States, had cautioned that the war could not be short and that Japan's victories would be fleeting if the Americans were allowed time to mobilize. His warnings, largely ignored, proved tragically prescient. From the Japanese perspective, the loss at Midway was catastrophic. The carriers that had once represented the spearhead of Japan's expansion were gone, along with experienced pilots whose skills were honed through months of combat. The psychological impact on Japanese command was profound. Officers who had spoken openly of invincibility were forced to confront the limitations of their planning and the resilience of their opponent. Midway marked the end of Japan's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations in the Pacific, shifting the strategic initiative permanently to the United States. For the Americans, the victory was remarkable not only for its tactical success, but also for the validation of careful planning, intelligence, and perseverance. The ability to anticipate the enemy's movements, coupled with decisive execution, transformed the Pacific theater. Midway became a turning point in the war, a demonstration that even a series of early defeats could be overcome through preparation, courage, and industrial mobilization. It was a stark lesson in the consequences of underestimating an opponent whose strengths extend beyond immediate combat power. Historians have long examined the battle as an example of how perception and miscalculation can determine outcomes in war. Japan's assumptions about the United States, rooted in cultural stereotypes and initial strategic success, created blind spots that the Americans were able to exploit. Yamamoto's insight, gained from years of observation in America, highlighted the contrast between superficial assessments of strength and the deeper realities of a nation capable of extraordinary mobilization. Midway illustrated that in war, intelligence, adaptability, and the recognition of an adversary's true capabilities are as decisive as raw military power. The aftermath of Midway forced Japan into a defensive posture for the remainder of the Pacific War. The empire could no longer pursue expansion without significant risk, and every subsequent operation required recalculation of strategy and resources. For the United States, Midway demonstrated the ability to project power across vast distances and leverage industrial might in ways that Japan had failed to anticipate. The battle underscored the profound importance of understanding not only the enemy's forces, but also the societal and industrial structures that support them. The Battle of Midway remains a landmark in military history, not only for its immediate tactical consequences, but for the lessons it provides in strategic thinking and the hazards of arrogance. Japan's underestimation of America, contrasted with Yamamoto's prescient warnings, created a scenario in which the consequences of misjudgment were catastrophic. Victory was possible through superior insight, preparation, and adaptability, rather than through confidence alone. Midway was a stark reminder that in war, as in life, underestimating the determination and capability of others can lead to consequences that echo far beyond the battlefield. In the months and years following the Battle of Midway, the full consequences of Japan's misjudgment became painfully clear. The Japanese Empire had entered the Pacific War with a series of rapid victories, buoyed by overconfidence and a belief in the inferiority of the United States. Yet the defeat at Midway highlighted that perception how one nation views the capabilities, resilience, and resolve of another can be as decisive as firepower or numbers. Japan's flawed assumptions about America's industrial strength, societal determination, and ability to sustain a protracted conflict revealed a critical strategic blind spot that would ultimately shape the course of the war. Before the war, Japanese planners had assumed that America's democratic society, with its freedoms and debates, indicated weakness. They believed that Americans would lack the discipline, endurance, and cohesion necessary to wage a long and costly war. The early months of Japanese victories reinforced this view, giving the impression that America's vast territory and population could be neutralized through shock and intimidation. Military officers, politicians, and propagandists all repeated the narrative that Japan had not only the skill but the moral superiority to secure dominance in the Pacific. This perception, however, was dangerously incomplete. Japan had underestimated the speed with which the United States could mobilize resources, organize labor, and translate industrial capacity into military strength. Midway exposed this miscalculation in the most dramatic fashion. American carriers, aircraft, and intelligence operations demonstrated not only skill and courage, but also the ability of an industrially powerful nation to sustain operations far from its shores. While Japan had relied on assumptions of weakness and passivity, the United States had harnessed the full measure of its society and economy, coordinating strategy, intelligence, and production with precision. In doing so, America turned the tide of the Pacific War in a matter of days, proving that underestimating an opponent's capacity for resilience can have catastrophic consequences. Admiral Yamamoto had understood this reality long before the war began. His experiences in the United States had revealed that industrial capacity, organizational skill, and societal determination were critical components of national power. He had cautioned repeatedly that Japan could achieve initial victories, but that the United States, if properly mobilized, could recover and respond with overwhelming force. These warnings, however, were largely ignored by Japan's military leadership, whose confidence in their own abilities and disdain for the American threat created a dangerous overreach. The disaster at Midway can be traced directly to the failure to heed these insights. The broader lesson of perception extends beyond the specifics of military strategy. Japan's misjudgment illustrates how assumptions about character, culture, and capability can distort decision-making at the highest levels. By believing that Americans were soft, complacent, and incapable of sustained effort, Japanese leaders constructed a false narrative of inevitability that influenced planning, operations, and expectations. Midway shattered that narrative, demonstrating that reality often defies assumptions and that understanding the true capabilities of an adversary is critical to any strategic endeavor. The industrial dimension of the conflict cannot be overstated. American shipyards, aircraft factories, and assembly lines, observed decades earlier by Yamamoto, represented a latent power that Japan could not hope to match in the long term. The ability to replace losses, expand production, and innovate technologically gave the United States a decisive advantage. Japan, by contrast, had limited resources, a smaller industrial base, and logistical vulnerabilities that made sustained offensive operations increasingly risky. The overconfidence that accompanied early victories obscured these strategic realities, leaving Japan unprepared for the prolonged conflict that the United States was fully capable of waging. Social resilience also played a critical role. Japan had assumed that Americans would be demoralized by setbacks such as Pearl Harbor and early losses in the Philippines and Malaya. In reality, the attack on Pearl Harbor galvanized the United States, uniting a divided nation in pursuit of a common objective. Workers entered factories in record numbers, engineers accelerated production schedules, and communities adapted to wartime demands with determination and ingenuity. Japan's assumption that American society could not sustain the pressures of war proved catastrophically wrong. By misjudging the social and cultural dimension of national power, Japanese leaders failed to account for the full scope of America's capability to respond. Midway also highlighted the human dimension of perception in warfare. Japanese commanders had placed confidence in their pilots, crews, and ships, but overconfidence led to operational rigidity and errors in judgment. The assumption that American forces would act predictably or retreat in the face of superior firepower left Japanese carriers exposed to attack at critical moments. Conversely, American forces demonstrated flexibility, courage, and improvisation, exploiting the vulnerabilities created by Japan's assumptions. The battle illustrates that perception is not merely a theoretical concern. It shapes decisions, movements, and ultimately outcomes on the battlefield. In the years that followed, Japan struggled to regain the initiative in the Pacific. Each subsequent engagement, from Guadalcanal to the Marianas, reflected the strategic reality that initial victories were insufficient to secure lasting dominance. The loss at Midway forced Japan onto the defensive, limiting options and stretching resources across an increasingly tenuous empire. The very hubris that had fueled expansion became a liability, revealing that strategic foresight, accurate assessment of adversaries, and humility in planning are essential to sustainable military success. The story of Japan's underestimation of the United States offers enduring lessons for students of history and strategy. Confidence, while valuable in motivating action, can become dangerous when it blinds leaders to reality. Misjudging an opponent's capabilities, whether industrial, social, or military, can create vulnerabilities that are exploited in moments of crisis. Yamamoto's insight serves as a reminder that careful observation, analysis, and respect for potential adversaries are essential components of strategic thought. The catastrophic results of ignoring these lessons underscore the interplay between perception and power in the conduct of war. In reflecting on the broader consequences, it becomes evident that Japan's downfall in the Pacific was not solely the result of tactical errors or battlefield misfortune. It was also the outcome of a failure to perceive accurately, to understand the depth of America's industrial capacity, societal resilience, and strategic potential. The Battle of Midway was not only a turning point in military terms. It was a moment that exposed the limitations of arrogance and the dangers of underestimating a nation. In the end, the misjudgment of an industrial colossus proved decisive, altering the trajectory of World War II and providing lessons that continue to resonate in the study of strategy, warfare, and history.